Intimidation, voter suppression and vote rigging are among the claims by the main opposition, which has also decried delays in printing ballot papers. To discuss this further, I'm now joined by Afro-Expert in democracy, governance as well as human rights, Advocate Tapiwa Chadya, who's been observing the election from the ground. Advocate Tapiwa, a pleasure to have you on the program this evening. We've heard allegations of ballot papers not arriving on time, also claims of intimidation as well. It doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in the situation there right now. Describe what's happening in Zimbabwe from what you've observed.
No, thank you for having me. You know, the situation has been rather different because I think from the inception of the opposition parties around about the year 2000, 2002, in those first elections, there was violence, there was a lot of violence and a lot of electoral irregularities. The elections were not free and fair, but they were a free and fair encounter. But what we have seen happening this year is rather different because this is the very first time that in the capital city, which is close proximity to the printing places, there were no ballot papers in the capital city. That is, with those issues in Harare, and those issues were also in most of the urban areas. In Bulawayo is where there were reports of the same, where people had woken up early in the morning, about 5 a.m., they went on to join the queues, anticipating and expecting to cast their democratic right, which is their vote. But unfortunately, the polling stations were not open. It was in Glenora, which is in the capital city of Harare. The polling centers were opened way after the closing time, 2-3 hours after, around about 8 p.m., 7 p.m. That was when the ballot papers did arrive. And then now there were issues with regards to voting, and there were unprecedented delays that we have seen happening in the capital city. But that was not the norm in the majority of the rural areas. And the rural areas are the strongholds of the ruling party. And in the urban areas, that is where the opposition parties do have a stronghold.
When you look at this extension of voting to day 2 now, it's also raised questions around logistical preparedness, call it that. How would you say this has affected the credibility of this election?
Well, when we look at elections in Africa, when we look at the credibility of elections, we don't quite have one barometer, one answer sheet to that question. But the general norm for, as far as Zimbabwe is concerned, the absence of violence has been one of the barometers which has been used to describe an election free and fair. But when we look at the issues as an example of access to media, access to television stations, having an electoral path which is equal, free and fair to everyone, that has not been a norm of the past. Yes, there was an absence of political violence. Yes, issues of threats and intimidations were there. But, you know, we saw that the opposition parties were not able to campaign freely. There were some no-go zones where they could not go and access. And as we speak now, the issue of ballot papers not arriving on time, the issue of parallel candidates being involved, it then puts a serious question with regards to the credibility of this election. If ever the signs and the telltale signs that we have seen, this election, there are some irregularities which we cannot ignore as a community, which cannot be ignored by the rest of the African continent. And if anything is to go by, it then tilts the credibility of the election not in good light, but in bad light. Because now, the difference that we have now is that people have got mobile phones, and these mobile phones can give you an update of what is exactly transpiring. So we saw what has been happening mostly in the capital city of Harare, where there were no ballot papers. The majority of the people could not afford to cast their ballot, and it raises serious concerns with regards to the issue of the credibility of the election.
This prolonged waiting time at polling stations has also raised some concerns, with some saying that it is a deliberate effort to undermine these elections. How would you say that has molded the perception of fairness when it comes to this poll or this election?
So, no, when we look at the people who have been waiting outside trying to cast their vote, versus the number of people who allegedly have already voted, the numbers don't quite tally. When we also look at the other polling stations which have been opened where there were issues and threats of violence by the ruling party, it raises serious concerns with regards to the credibility of this election. But be it as it may, we have seen that even some of the civic organizations were kicked out of the country. They were not able to come and observe the elections. And the serious concern now that the majority of the people of Zimbabwe have is probably having a repeat of what happened in 2008, where it doesn't matter who cast the vote. It doesn't matter the number of who might have voted, let's say, against the ruling party. But what matters most is those who count the elections. Those who announce the election, they become very key and critical because they have been, of late, been used by the ruling party. To the opposition party, the question is, what happens if the election is stolen? Will people go into the streets? Are we going to have a government of national unity? That is the serious concern that the opposition party has currently. That is the Bermuda Triangle of the opposition party. That is the conundrum that the opposition parties have, because we have seen that each and every single time whenever there's issues that has to do with the credibility of the election, at the end of the day, nothing happens, primarily because the opposition party, in most instances, does not have equipment or machinery to be able to transform their vote into reality, transform the number of voters where people would have voted for them into them taking over the power from the ruling party.
Without preempting the outcome of this election, would you say there's an air of anxiety regarding any possibility that there might be a sparing up of violence yet again after the results are announced here?
The president of Zimbabwe is called the crocodile. He is not called the crocodile for nothing. When we go back into the last election where Robert Mugabe was sitting in the 2008 presidential elections, Robert Mugabe had considered, that is on record, he had considered the election. But the last man standing for ZANU-PF, the person who made the difference, the person who stole the election was Emmerson Mnangagwa. This is on record. He himself, the president, has come out and said that in his own evidence that he has given in some of the rallies and general discussions that he has had. To say, if he loses the election, is he going to leave power? Is he going to leave the office? That becomes very tricky because he didn't do it in 2008. He was the one who changed and kept on power within ZANU-PF, which led then to the government of national unity. So with the results which have been coming in now, the results have been suggesting that the CCC, the opposition party, has been making serious inroads, even in the strongholds of ZANU-PF. Yeah. But obviously those results are not official results. So with the people who have been sending out the results, with even the civic organizations, we saw about 41 people from the civic organizations being arrested by the government. And the allegations has been that there's been a breach of security, and they had computers where they were tabulating, they were having parallel structure that was collecting the results from the different polling stations where they had put people to go and monitor and observe the election. So from where we are now, yes, anxiety, it goes without saying that the people will be anxious, primarily because this could be an election that transforms and changes the trajectory or the direction of the country and the people of Zimbabwe, together with the Southern African, the SADC region also being concerned. So anxiety will obviously be there, also because it is just an election where there is a lot which is at stake.
At this point, have we heard from the country's electoral commission regarding the progress of these elections? And if so, what has the agency said?
From the election command center, results have been trickling in very slowly, at a very slow rate. What we have only seen is that there's been results only of uncontested areas. Those are the results which had come in. But as far as the results in terms of the presidential election, in terms of the number of the MPs that has not started to be published, primarily because as a norm, they would want to wait up until they get all the election results. And in some instances, this is when now there comes an issue that has to do with serious delays in the publication of the results. But in accordance to the rules and regulations of the electoral system in the country, each and every single polling station pastes and posts the results outside of the polling station. That then has necessitated the majority of the election observers to be able to take photographs and then send these results to their own electoral centers. But now with the arrest of about 41 people who were also responsible for collecting these results because they're polling agents, it then brings in an issue of the credibility of the election, because the observers are then not able to tabulate their own results, primarily because the equipment that they've been using has been confiscated by the government.
As we wrap up our conversation, Advocate Tapiwa, speaking to the laymen or the voters in Zimbabwe as well, how would you describe the general sentiment or mood of people in that country?
When we look at the unemployment rate, nothing has been giving people hope as just voting. People have lost, they've been disenfranchised, because the unemployment rate is sitting at above 90%. The industries are not working. There's no electricity. The infrastructure, yes, is about being built now, coming up. But with the majority of the industries, 98, 97% of the industries not working, you then are bound to attract a lot of attention from everyone, from the youth, from the young, from the old, when it comes to the issue of the election. Because this is the only time that the disenfranchised people are given hope, are given power to decide into whoever is going to rule the country, into having their own councillors. So this becomes something which is key and crucial, because this is the only time that the people are given power. And they came out in their numbers wanting to vote. But unfortunately, in the urban areas, Harare, notably in Harare, we have seen that the absence of ballot papers, it infuriated them, but they were resilient. They stayed at the polling stations up until the next morning. There were bonfires which were there. People were sharing blankets, and those who were there, they were calling the ones who had not been able to stay overnight. They were calling them back to say, come back now and cast your vote. So we saw a serious sense of solidarity. We saw and I observed a serious sense of people having some level of hope in a hopeless situation. So this means a lot to the majority of the Zimbabweans. The ability and the potential of them to be able to change and to dictate what happens in the country, it really has given them some sense of hope. And the desire is that let their hope transform into reality.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. That was Advocate Tapiwa Chadya speaking to us about the overall atmosphere and sentiment surrounding these elections in Zimbabwe.